You've struggled to establish personal limits throughout your existence, yet they've consistently fallen apart. You've examined the literature. You've drilled the expressions. You've pledged to decline and stand by it. However, without fail, your limits disintegrate. An individual gives you a look of letdown, and you capitulate. An individual employs guilt, and you concede. An individual requires support, and you forfeit your own well-being, disregarding all the vows you made to remain resolute. And you've persuaded yourself that you're merely not resilient enough, that limits aren't suited for individuals like you, that your sympathetic disposition renders sturdy limits unfeasible. But Carl Jung revealed a truth that transforms it all. The limits that sympathetic people endeavor to create falter because they're the incorrect type of limits. There are 7 distinct limits, 7 that Jung designated as lethal, not as they damage you, but as they're so unyielding, so inflexible, so mentally fatal to anyone seeking to control or utilize you, that once you enact them, you become essentially impervious to the strategies that have governed you all your days. Jung invested decades formulating what he dubbed the Citadel Method, a comprehensive mental blueprint of limits tailored for sympathetic persons who have never succeeded in upholding traditional limits. And here's what renders these 7 limits lethal. They don't necessitate vigor or resolve to uphold. They're organized in a fashion that they sustain themselves, functioning at a tier below deliberate selection, safeguarding you even when your deliberate thoughts yearns to concede or surrender. Today, we're delving into each of these 7 lethal limits in thorough depth. What they entail, why they succeed when alternative limits stumble, and how to enact Jung's Citadel Method so that you ultimately become impervious to the control and utilization that has dominated your existence. Carl Gustav Jung came into the world in 1875 in Keswill, Switzerland, into a household where limits were practically absent. His mother endured what Jung later identified as dissociative occurrences, where her temperament would alter drastically, and young Carl never knew which variant of his mother he would face at any instant. His father was sentimentally aloof and despondent, incapable of creating limits with the obligations of his ministry or with his own philosophical torment. Jung matured in a setting where mental limits were so deficient that he cultivated what he termed extreme openness. He ingested the sentimental and mental conditions of all those near him, possessed no definite perception of where he concluded and others commenced, and battled intensely with forming any form of private zone or constraints. This initial encounter of limitless living molded Jung's complete mental vocation. His partnership with Sigmund Freud from 1906 to 1913 was in various aspects and prolonged conflict with limits. Freud insisted on utter fidelity and conceptual concordance from his adherents, and Jung found himself incapable of forming the limits essential to shield his own emerging notions. He would form inner constraints. I will not alter my reasoning to preserve Freud's endorsement, but these limits would swiftly dissolve under the strain of Freud's allure, Freud's intellectual supremacy, and Jung's own longing for the paternal symbol Freud embodied. It was only when Jung underwent what he termed a mental fracture in 1913, a total disintegration of his connection with Freud that was so catastrophic it almost obliterated him. That he comprehended something essential. Traditional limits don't operate for particular character configurations. Something more definitive, more architecturally robust, more self-preservation oriented was essential. During his stage of engagement with the subconscious from 1913 to 1919, chronicled in what would evolve into the Red Book, Jung formulated the groundwork of what he would later dub the Citadel method. He wasn't addressing limits abstractly, but empirically uncovering through severe experimentation and mistakes what sorts of mental configurations could truly shield him from the crushing obligations of the subconscious, from the mental extrapolations of others, from the communal strains that endangered to erode his personal awareness. Jung's principal writings, including Psychological Classifications from 1921, two compositions on analytical psychology, the linkages between the ego and the subconscious, the advancement of personality, and the configuration and operations of the psyche all encompass components of the Citadel method. But it's chiefly in his therapeutic practice and his confidential correspondences that Jung delineated the 7 distinct limits that constitute this method. Jung perceived that sympathetic persons repeatedly failed to uphold limits, not because they were feeble or unengaged, but because they were attempting to enact limits crafted for people with firm mental configurations. And sympathetic people don't have firm configurations. They have penetrable ones. Traditional limits demand ongoing proactive preservation. You have to recollect your constraint, proactively impose it, deliberately opt not to concede when you're being compelled. This operates adequately for people whose baseline condition is constrained and who sporadically need to impose constraints. But for sympathetic people whose baseline condition is penetrable and who are perpetually being compelled, infiltrated, and inundated, this type of proactive preservation falters because it demands assets, resolve, vigor, deliberate awareness that sympathetic people don't possess, because those assets are being depleted by the very ingestion and inundation that the limits are intended to avert. Jung's realization was that sympathetic people required limits that were architecturally self-preservation oriented. Limits that function mechanically at a tier below deliberate selection. Limits that didn't demand ongoing resolve to maintain, because they were integrated into the blueprint of how the sympathetic person interacted with others. He designated these lethal limits because once appropriately enacted, they didn't just constrain others' entry. They rendered sympathetic people utterly impervious to the controls, guilt inducements, sentimental compulsion, and utilizing obligations that had formerly prevailed. And Jung revealed that there were precisely 7 of these limits, 7 that operated in harmony to form what he dubbed the Citadel, a comprehensive mental protective configuration that shielded the sympathetic person without demanding them to become stiff, sealed, or isolated. The first lethal limit Jung recognized is what he dubbed the rejection of sentimental duty. This limit is straightforward to articulate, but transformative in its consequences. You are not accountable for other people's sentiments, not their letdown when you decline, not their fury when you form a constraint, not their melancholy when you prioritize your own needs, not their unease when you make a selection they dislike. You are accountable for your own conduct, for interacting with others with fundamental courtesy and benevolence, but you are not accountable for overseeing, averting, or remedying the sentimental responses they have to your limits. This appears evident when articulated distinctly, but Jung perceived that sympathetic people function under a wholly contrary presumption. They think they are accountable for others' sentimental conditions. And this presumption renders every limit impossible to uphold, because any limit will provoke someone some adverse sentiment. And if you're accountable for averting that sentiment, you can't uphold the limit. In The Advancement of Personality, Jung investigated how this presumption in sentimental duty evolves. He chronicled that sympathetic youngsters, particularly those with sentimentally unstable or controlling guardians, learned that their endurance hinged on overseeing the guardian's sentimental condition. If they could maintain the guardian joyful, serene, or content, they were secure. If the guardian became furious, let down, or anxious, the youngster would be disciplined, overlooked, or sentimentally forsaken. The youngster learned sometimes overtly, but more often covertly, that they were accountable for the guardian's sentimental modulation. And this youngster adjustment, while vital for endurance, then becomes a confinement in adulthood, because you persist to think you're accountable for everyone's sentiments. And this renders you endlessly controllable by anyone who learns to employ their sentimental responses against your limits. Jung collaborated with a client, a lady in her 30s, who could not uphold any limit with her mother, because every limit endeavor was met with her mother's weeping, let down, and allegations of being an inadequate daughter. The client would form a constraint. "I can't come this weekend." And her mother would sob, would articulate how wounded she was, would recall the daughter of all she had forfeited, and the daughter would swiftly dissolve the limit because she felt accountable for her mother's distress. Jung's collaboration with this client involved assisting her perceive that her mother's sentimental responses were her mother's duty, not the daughter's. When the daughter stated she couldn't come, that was an impartial detail about the daughter's availability. The mother's response to that detail, let down, wound, fury, was the mother's selection about how to react to not obtaining what she desired. This differentiation is vital, and it's what renders this first limit lethal. You can regulate your conduct, but you cannot regulate others' responses to your conduct. And when you assume duty for their responses, you grant them total regulation over you, because they can always react in ways that make you feel culpable enough to dissolve your limits. Jung's Citadel method requires that you enact this first limit. Unequivocally, you are not accountable for others' sentimental responses to your limits. You can be courteous in how you convey limits, but once you've articulated a constraint, the other person's sentimental reaction to that constraint is theirs to oversee, not yours to remedy. And Jung emphasized this limit must become mechanical, not something you deliberately recall yourself of, but something that functions at the tier of fundamental mental configuration. The second lethal limit Jung recognized is what he dubbed the interdiction of excessive clarification. This limit asserts you clarify your limits once distinctly and courteously, and then you cease clarifying, no rationales, no intricate justifications, no safeguarding your selection, no attempting to make the other person grasp or consent with your limit. You articulate it once and that's adequate. Jung perceived that sympathetic people routinely excessively clarify their limits because they subconsciously think that if they can just clarify sufficiently well, make the other person totally grasp, the person will embrace the limit and won't be distressed. But Jung chronicled that excessive clarification actually undermines limits rather than bolstering them, and it does so in multiple manners. First, excessive clarification conveys that your limit is bargainable. When you expend considerable vigor rationalizing and safeguarding a constraint, you're covertly implying that if your rationale isn't sufficient, if the other person can identify defects in your logic, the limit might shift. Second, excessive clarification encourages the other person to dispute your limit, to contest your motives, to clarify why your rationale isn't legitimate. This transforms every limit into a contention that you have to prevail in. And if you fail the contention, you feel compelled to dissolve the limit. Third, excessive clarification depletes you. You expend so much vigor safeguarding and rationalizing that you have no vigor left to uphold the actual constraint. And fourth, excessive clarification discloses susceptibility. Controlling people learn which clarifications succeed and which don't, and they learn to assail the feeblest rationales to compel you to dissolve limits. In two compositions on analytical psychology, Jung investigated the mental purpose of excessive clarification and associated it to what he dubbed the compulsion to be grasped. Sympathetic people, Jung observed, often have a profound subconscious presumption that being misgrasped is perilous, that if people don't totally understand their inner experience and motives, something dreadful will transpire. This presumption typically stems from childhood, where being misgrasped by caregivers led to discipline, rejection, or forsaking. The youngster learned that endurance required making adults grasp, and this generated a compulsive need to clarify and excessively clarify that endures into adulthood, even when the endurance threat is long past. Jung collaborated with a client, a gentleman in his 40s, who would expend hours clarifying and rationalizing every limit he endeavored to form with his spouse. If he desired to spend an evening solitary, he would present intricate clarifications about his need for isolation, his pressure levels, his mental condition, essentially constructing a legal argument for why his limit was sensible. His spouse learned to simply await for him to complete his clarifications and then dismantle his logic, indicating inconsistencies or proposing alternative resolutions that wouldn't necessitate the limit. And the gentleman, unable to safeguard against her rebuttals, would dissolve the limit. Jung's collaboration with him involved enacting the lethal limit of clarification interdiction. Articulate the limit once. Do not safeguard it. Do not rationalize it beyond fundamental courteous communication. And do not participate in disputes about whether it's sensible. The gentleman practiced this with Jung's assistance. "I'm spending tonight solitary" became the complete communication with no expansion about why or rationalization of the need. His spouse, habituated to lengthy clarifications she could dispute, was initially perplexed and then irate at what she perceived as his deficiency of communication. But Jung assisted the client grasp that articulating a limit distinctly is complete communication. The motives behind the limit are private details you can opt to share or not share, but they're not essential for the limit to be legitimate. Over time, as the client upheld this lethal limit of non-clarification, his spouse learned that his constraints were not bargainable through dispute, and the power equilibrium in the relationship fundamentally altered. The third lethal limit, and Jung regarded this one of the most arduous for sympathetic people to enact, is what he dubbed the endurance of letdown. This limit demands that you permit others to be let down by your selections without hastening to remedy their letdown, recompense for it, or modify your selection to mitigate it. Someone solicits you for something, you decline. They articulate letdown, and you permit them to be let down. You don't immediately endeavor to improve it by partially conceding, by clarifying why you had to decline, by vowing to compensate them subsequently, or by altering your decline to an acceptance. You merely permit letdown to exist without attempting to oversee it. Jung perceived that sympathetic people find this limit almost insufferable because they experience others' letdown not as the other person's sentimental reaction, but as proof of their own deficiency, their own egocentrism, their own insufficiency as a benevolent person. In the linkages between the ego and the subconscious, Jung investigated what he dubbed the sympathetic culpability complex, where sympathetic people feel culpable, not for having actually injured anyone, but merely for not fulfilling everyone's desires and requirements. Someone desires something from you, you don't furnish it, and you feel culpable even though you've done nothing objectively erroneous. This culpability renders enduring others let down mentally insufferable, because the letdown activates the culpability, and the culpability can only be alleviated by dissolving the limit and furnishing the person what they desire. Jung collaborated with a client, a lady in her 20s, who could not uphold limits with companions because she could not endure their letdown. If a companion desired her to participate in an occasion and she didn't want to attend, she would accept anyway, because the notion of letting down the companion was insufferable. Or, if she initially declined, the companion's articulation of let down, "Oh, I was really anticipating you'd be there," would immediately activate such intense culpability that she'd alter her decline to an acceptance. Jung's therapeutic collaboration involved assisting this lady grasp that letdown is not injury. Companions being let down, that you're not accessible, doesn't injure them. It's merely them experiencing the reality that they don't always obtain what they desire, and learning to endure that reality without dissolving to avert the letdown is part of mature connection. Jung had this client practice what he dubbed letdown exposure. She would intentionally let down people in minor ways and then endure the discomfort without attempting to remedy it. She'd decline minor solicitations and permit companions to be let down. She'd articulate preferences that varied from what others desired and endure their letdown that she didn't share their preference. Gradually, through repeated exposure, she revealed that letdown didn't obliterate connections, didn't make people forsake her, and didn't mean she was a bad person. It just meant she was a separate person with her own needs and constraints. And as she cultivated endurance for others let down, this third lethal limit became self-preservation oriented. She no longer had to deliberately opt to uphold a limit against someone's letdown because she had architecturally altered her relationship to let down itself. The fourth lethal limit Jung recognized is what he dubbed the segregation of benevolence from obedience. This limit differentiates between having benevolence for someone and obeying their solicitations. You can have profound benevolence for someone's welfare, sincerely want them to be joyful, feel sympathy for their difficulties, and still decline their solicitations. Benevolence and obedience are not the same thing, and sympathetic people must enact a limit that architecturally segregates them, because sympathetic people routinely confound the two. They think that if they have benevolence for someone, they must accept when that person solicits something. And if they decline, it means they don't have benevolence. This confounding renders limits impossible, because every limit feels like a breach of your benevolent disposition. In psychological classifications, Jung investigated what he dubbed the sentiment function and observed that individuals with a dominant sentiment function often equate sentiment with action. If I feel sympathy, I must act on it. If I feel benevolence, I must exhibit it through obedience with others' requirements. But Jung emphasized that mature use of the sentiment function demands differentiating the internal experience of benevolence from the external behavior of obedience. You can feel profound benevolence for someone's difficulty while concurrently acknowledging that obeying their solicitation would be detrimental to you, to them, or to the connection. The sentiment and the action are separate, and they don't have to correspond. Jung chronicled a case of a client, a gentleman in his 50s who labored as a physician who could not form limits with patients because he confounded having benevolence for them with obeying all their solicitations. Patients would contact at all hours, would solicit house calls for non-urgencies, would anticipate him to be constantly accessible. The gentleman obeyed because he had benevolence for his patients and thought that benevolence required complete accessibility. He was depleted, bitter, and heading toward exhaustion. But he couldn't imagine declining because declining felt like not having benevolence. Jung's labor involved enacting the lethal limit of benevolence-obedience segregation. You can have profound benevolence and still say, "I'm not accessible tonight," or "You need to contact during office hours," or "That solicitation isn't possible for me to fulfill." The gentleman initially experienced this limit as being chilly and lacking benevolence. But Jung assisted him perceive that unlimited accessibility wasn't actually benefiting his patients well. It was hindering them from cultivating their own capacity to handle minor medical matters, was generating dependence rather than healthy self-sufficiency, and was diminishing the quality of care he could provide because he was too depleted to function optimally. The limit of limited accessibility, properly enacted, was actually more benevolent than false unlimited accessibility because it was sustainable and it advanced patients' independence. As the gentleman practiced this segregation of benevolence from obedience, he revealed he could feel genuine sympathy for patients while concurrently upholding clear constraints on his accessibility. And the culpability he'd anticipated to feel never emerged because he wasn't actually lacking benevolence. He was being prudently constrained. The fifth lethal limit is what Jung dubbed the eradication of anticipatory concession. This limit forbids you from conceding to others' potential requirements or desires before they've even articulated them. Sympathetic people routinely scan their surroundings for what others might require and furnish it before being solicited, thinking this averts conflict and validates their benevolent disposition. But Jung perceived that anticipatory concession actually conditions others to anticipate yourself, forfeit and renders limits impossible, because you've generated a relational pattern where you foresee and fulfill requirements before others even have to solicit. And then you resent them for exploiting when you've been the one generating the pattern. In The Advancement of Personality, Jung investigated the origins of anticipatory concession in childhood settings, where youngsters learned that foreseeing and fulfilling a guardian's requirements before the guardian became angry or let down was the only way to remain secure. The youngster cultivated hyperalertness to the guardian's sentimental conditions and learned to concede before being solicited, because waiting to be solicited often resulted in discipline for not having already known what was required. This generates a childhood adjustment that becomes a destructive adult pattern, because you continue to anticipatorily concede to everyone, depleting yourself while conditioning others that they never have to solicit for anything, because you'll always foresee and furnish. Jung collaborated with a client, a lady in her 40s, who was a mother and a supervisor at work who anticipatorily conceded to everyone in her life. She would foresee what her children might require and furnish it before they solicited. She would foresee what her employees might desire and organize things before they requested them. She would foresee what her partner might prefer and modify her behavior before he articulated a preference. She was constantly depleted from this foreseeing and concession, and she was bitter that no one seemed to value her efforts. But Jung assisted her perceive that she had generated this pattern herself by conditioning everyone that they never had to solicit, because she would always foresee. Jung's lethal limit required her to cease anticipatory concession entirely. She could reply to direct solicitations, but she could not foresee and furnish before being solicited. This was tormenting for her initially, because she could see requirements, could foresee desires, and not furnishing felt like deficiency. But Jung emphasized that this limit was essential for two reasons. First, it ceased her depleting pattern of constant foreseeing and provision. And second, it compelled others to actually solicit for what they required, which generated opportunities to decline, which generated sustainable connection rather than one-sided service. As she enacted this limit, she revealed that most of the requirements she had been foreseeing and fulfilling weren't actually urgent. People could wait, could solicit, or could fulfill their own requirements. And when they did solicit, she could opt whether to concede based on her actual capacity rather than feeling compelled, because she had conditioned them to expect automatic provision. The sixth lethal limit Jung recognized is what he dubbed the denial of urgency designation. This limit demands that you deny to treat every solicitation, every requirement, every sentimental condition of others as an urgency demanding your immediate reply. Sympathetic people routinely experience others' requirements as urgencies. Someone is distressed and you must immediately aid. Someone has an issue and you must immediately resolve it. Someone wants your attention and you must immediately furnish it. This urgency reply is driven by what Jung dubbed the sympathetic alert mechanism that was tuned in childhood to treat any sign of distress in caregivers as a threat demanding immediate reply. But in adulthood, this mechanism renders limits impossible because you cannot uphold a constraint when you're in urgency reply mode. In the configuration and operations of the psyche, Jung investigated the neurological and mental mechanisms of the alert mechanism and observed that sympathetic people needed to retune this mechanism to differentiate genuine urgencies from normal solicitations that simply feel pressing because of conditioned reply. Jung collaborated with clients to enact the lethal limit of urgency denial. When someone presents something as pressing, or when you feel the internal urgency alert activating, you pause and deliberately evaluate whether this is actually an urgency or whether your mechanism is simply habituated to treating all requirements as pressing. Jung chronicled a case of a client, a gentleman in his 30s, whose mother would contact him multiple times per day with urgencies that demanded his immediate attention. The urgencies ranged from actual medical matters to being unable to operate her television remote. The client would abandon everything every time because his mother framed everything as pressing, and his sympathetic alert mechanism responded to her framing. Jung's labor involved assisting the client perceive that his mother's framing of everything as an urgency was control, either deliberate or undeliberate, and his urgency reply to this framing was enabling her acquired helplessness while obliterating his capacity to have his own life. Enacting the lethal limit required the client to cease responding to apparent pressing with automatic urgency reply. When his mother contacted with an urgency, he would calmly evaluate whether it was actually pressing, was someone's life or safety at risk, and reply accordingly. If it wasn't a genuine urgency, he would reply on his own schedule, not on the schedule her pressing demanded. His mother intensified initially, framing things as even more pressing to try to restore his urgency reply. But as he upheld the limit, she gradually learned that pressing framing didn't work anymore, and she began either resolving issues herself or soliciting for aid in non-urgency ways. This sixth lethal limit liberated the client from constant urgency mode and allowed him to reply to others from a place of selection rather than from automatic alert activation. The seventh and final lethal limit, which Jung regarded the cornerstone of the entire Citadel method, is what he dubbed the establishment of departure routines. This limit demands that you form clear conditions under which you will depart connections, discussions, or situations, and that you actually perform those departures when the conditions are met. Most sympathetic people have no departure routines. They linger in harmful connections indefinitely. linger in damaging discussions hoping to remedy them, continue in situations that violate them repeatedly because they haven't formed clear thresholds for when they will depart. And even if they have contemplated such thresholds, they don't actually perform the departure when the threshold is crossed. In investigations into the phenomenology of the self, Jung investigated what he dubbed the compulsion to linger, where certain individuals felt mentally unable to depart connections or situations, even when those contexts were clearly obliterating them. Jung associated this compulsion to early attachment injury, where departing or being departed meant obliteration, generating a pattern where any form of departure felt like death. But Jung emphasized that without clear departure routines, all other limits are ultimately powerless. Because if the other person knows you will never actually depart, no matter what they do, they have no incentive to respect any of your constraints. Jung collaborated with a client, a lady in her 20s, who was in a connection with someone who repeatedly violated every limit she formed. She would articulate a constraint, he would violate it. She would be distressed but linger in the connection. Jung asked her directly, "What are your departure conditions? Under what circumstances will you actually depart?" She had no answer because she had never contemplated it. She subconsciously thought she couldn't depart, that she had to linger and keep trying to make him respect her limits. Jung's establishment of the seventh lethal limit required her to form clear departure routines. If he violated a specific limit more than twice, she would depart. Not threaten to depart, not give him another opportunity, but actually perform the departure. The lady formed her routines with Jung's assistance, conveyed them distinctly to her partner, and when he violated a limit for the second time, after the routine was conveyed, she departed. The man was astonished because he hadn't believed she would actually do it. Her previous pattern had been to threaten, but never follow through. But the lethal limit of departure routines requires that you don't threaten. You simply have clear conditions and you perform the departure when conditions are met. Jung observed that in many cases the formation and actual performance of departure routines paradoxically preserved connections because the other person finally understood that limits were real and non-bargainable. In other cases, the departure routines revealed that the connection was unsustainable, and the departure, while agonizing, liberated the client to find connections where limits were respected. Now these 7 lethal limits operate together as Jung's citadel method. They are not isolated constraints, but interlocking configurations that bolster each other. The rejection of sentimental duty makes it possible to endure letdown. The interdiction of excessive clarification averts disputes that would undermine the segregation of benevolence from obedience. The eradication of anticipatory concession generates space where the denial of urgency designation can function. And all 6 of these limits are ultimately bolstered by the 7th, the departure routines which give force to every other limit by forming that violations have real consequences. Jung dubbed this a citadel because properly enacted these limits generate a mental configuration that shields the sympathetic person without requiring constant proactive defense. The limits preserve themselves at a configuration level, You don't have to recollect to reject sentimental duty every time someone articulates let down. The limit functions mechanically because you fundamentally altered your relationship to others' sentiments. You don't have to deliberately resist excessive clarifying. The limit interdicts it at a tier beneath selection. You don't have to endeavor to endure letdown. You've cultivated endurance through exposure and practice, so it no longer unsettles you. Jung wrote in The Advancement of Personality, "The citadel is not a confinement that segregates the individual from connection. It is a configuration that makes genuine connection possible for the first time. Without the citadel, the sympathetic person is an entrance that anyone can traverse at any time. With the citadel, the sympathetic person becomes an autonomous realm with an entrance that opens and closes according to the dweller's selection. This is not segregation. It is the formation of the self as separate and shielded, which is the prerequisite for genuine closeness rather than amalgamation." In the final years of his life, Jung reflected on the citadel method in letters to clients, and one passage encapsulates his ultimate wisdom about these lethal limits. He wrote, "You will forfeit connections when you enact the citadel. This is unavoidable and essential. The connections that are forfeited were built on your absence of limits, on your accessibility for utilization, on your willingness to forfeit yourself. These connections cannot endure your autonomy because they were never connections between two selves. They were connections between a self and a purpose, between a person and an asset. Lament these forfeitures, but do not rue them, and observe what arises in the space generated by the citadel. New connections will form, or existing connections will evolve based on genuine reciprocity and mutual esteem. These are the connections the citadel makes possible, and they are worth more than 1,000 connections built on yourself forsaking. If you've identified yourself in this delving, if you've been endeavoring to form limits your entire existence and they've never endured, I want you to comprehend that the problem isn't your resilience or your engagement. The problem is that you've been endeavoring to enact limits designed for people with different mental configurations. Jung's citadel method is specifically crafted for sympathetic individuals who need limits that preserve themselves, that don't dissolve under strain, that function beneath the level of deliberate resolve, because your deliberate resolve is already depleted from ingestion and inundation. Hit like on this video and subscribe to Wake and Win right now, because enacting the citadel method requires ongoing assistance, ongoing schemas, ongoing reminders of why these limits are vital, even when others label them chilly or egocentric, and comment below with a number from 1 to 7 indicating which lethal limit you most need to enact. Don't expand, don't clarify, just a number. Let this be your first practice of non-excessive clarification. And if this video provided you the schema you needed to finally comprehend why limits have never worked for you and what kind of limits might actually endure, share it with another sympathetic person who's been endeavoring and failing to form constraints. Sometimes the most sympathetic thing we can do is demonstrate to each other that there are limit methods designed for our specific psychology, that we're not too feeble to have limits. We've just been using the wrong limits. Jung's citadel method doesn't make you stiff or sealed or isolated. It makes you autonomous. It makes you impervious to control and utilization, not through constant alertness, but through configuration shielding that functions mechanically. May you construct your citadel one lethal limit at a time. May you reveal that the connections worth preserving actually intensify when you're finally shielded. And may you learn that being a citadel doesn't avert connection. It makes genuine connection possible for the first time in your life. Become impervious to manipulation through structural protection. The citadel makes genuine connection possible. What if your limits could hold without effort? Could this be the key to your freedom? Why do traditional methods fail? How does the first limit change everything? Is over-clarification your downfall? Can you endure letdown? Is benevolence the same as obedience? Are you anticipating too much? Is every need an urgency? Do you have departure routines?